I was watching my daughter's kids while she and her husband went out of town. They have a teenage daughter. Let's just name her Alyssa. At like 3 a.m., I'm awoken by a weird rustling sound and look out the window to see movement. I saw a boy emerge from the bushes on the side of the house. I saw a bike tossed in the lawn that definitely wasn't ours. My first thought was that this was some sort of burglary. But since he looked young and came through a bike, I figured scaring him straight would be enough for him to decide to head home. Didn't want to ruin a teenager's life by calling the cops straight away. So I went out on the porch, flipped the lights on, and said, "Can I help you?" in my classroom voice. The guy looked surprised but not nervous. He was wearing a Letterman style jacket, but once I got a clear view of him in the street lights, he seemed much older than my granddaughter. He looked dirty and more wiry than athletic. He walked up closer to the house and said, "Yeah, I'm looking for Alyssa." I gave him a disapproving stare, hoping he'd realize that he came looking for a girl late at night, and a grumpy old person answered, "It's time to split." I'm thinking what must have happened is Alyssa and her parents were going out of town, and maybe before she knew I'd be staying over, she told a secret older boyfriend to come over. It was late and I was alone with several kids, so I didn't want him coming any closer to the house. I also thought it was weird he came so late and wanted to be sure Alyssa actually wanted to talk to him. So I said, "I'm sorry, who?" He said Alyssa. You know, Alyssa last name, this is her house. I thought he knew her full name. They must at least be friends. I said, "You wait here." He started to walk up and I felt a sick burning in my gut. Instinct kicked in. I yelled, "No, stop, freeze." Then readjusted and said, "You stay right here. This is private property. Don't take another step closer. Wait there." So I go in, and Alyssa is asleep just one room over from where the rustling first occurred. I wake her up and say something to the effect of, "I don't know what the big idea was to have friends over this time of night, but you tell them to go home." She seemed to have no clue what I was talking about. I say, "There's a guy outside waiting for you." Confused, she gets up and goes to the window. She sees him and then goes white as a sheet. "He asked for me?" "Yeah." "But by name?" "Yes." Call the police. I've never seen him in my life." I called 911 immediately, but as I was on the phone with them, Alyssa started tugging at my arm. "He's coming up." I had younger kids in the house to think about, so I kept the door latched and pulled it just enough for the latch and yelled, "I asked my husband and none of us know an Alyssa last name. Leave my property or I'm calling 911. He got angry and started yelling for her to come out. Thankfully, the police came pretty quickly, and when he heard sirens, he grabbed the bike and just ran off. I watched where he was running and jumped into the passenger side of a car without headlights or front plates and sped off. The police followed the same direction to which I had pointed them in, but they didn't get him. They advised us to take all her social media details offline, that is, if she was sure she didn't know this person. They also said they had a couple of similar reports recently and they were looking into it. I got a heavy-duty lock, and she slept in my room for the remainder of my visit. So to that scraggly man that came up to my porch, let's not meet. This past Monday, my coworkers and I returned to our hotel from a day of work out in the field. Rebecca and I walked to our rooms, and as we stood outside of our rooms, I opened mine and I saw something in the bathroom. I said, "Hello?" Nobody answered. My first instinct was that it was a cleaning lady in there for some reason, and then I saw my bag with my clothes in her hand. I said to my coworker, "There's a woman in my room." Then I asked the woman, "What are you doing with my stuff?" It gets a little fuzzy here because I can't remember everything I said and what she said, but she kept mumbling about how her key still worked, how it still worked, and that's how she got in. I was in shock. She was obviously very flustered having been caught mid-robbery. She dropped my bags and fumbled around with her purse and a white plastic bag. By this time, my coworker was behind me watching all of the insanity unfold. This woman was scrambling and walking towards the door, and I said, "What's in the bag?" Thinking it's probably my stuff, and so she said, No, it's just my things, I'll show you. And so she did. I looked and I didn't see anything of mine, and so since I'm obviously in shock at the same time, I let her leave. I went into my room and it's been absolutely ransacked. I did a quick look around to see if anything had been taken. All of my electronics were still there. Then I went to the bathroom and I saw my underwear, my bikini, and my clothes shoved into my own bags randomly. Even my passport was shoved in there. Then I looked on the counter and I saw she had gotten into my medication. I'm not sure what was going through my head at the moment, other than I wanted it back. So I ran out the door to go find her. I ran to the laundry room downstairs and out to the sides of the hotels, but I didn't see her. I realized I was never going to find her. So my coworker and I went down to the lobby to tell them what happened, and then we called the police. We went back up to my room and I noticed that there was a metal bat on my bed and a little larger one of those novelty wooden bats you can get at a baseball game, but there was also a flashlight on the end. She must have left it behind in a hurry. She also left behind a necklace that must have fallen out of her bag when she was scrambling with mine. I was mostly freaking out at this point because I had thought she had gotten away with my medication that I need. The police got there and took our statements and looked around our room as well. One thing I noticed was that there was bits of drywall in the sink, and I pointed that out to the cops, but none of us really knew where it came from. We started looking at the door and the windows to see if she had pried her way in somehow, but there was nothing. So we kind of just went with the idea that she had a spare key or something, even though the hotel front desk was very adamant that she could have not had a spare. The officer that came brought 2 more officers as backup because they thought the woman might still be in the vicinity. But after our statements were taken, there was nothing else they could really do, so they left. I sat down to finally make some calls to tell some people, and as I'm on my phone, I'm thinking about the drywall in the sink, and it didn't make sense to me at all. So I'm on my phone and looking at the drywall in the mirror on the wall right above it, and then it hit me. I got my coworker and asked her to help me pull this mirror off the wall. We took the mirror down, and there's a hole just as big enough for a desperate junkie to squeeze through. I asked Brian and Rebecca if I should call the cops again to let them know we had found this, and my boss said, "There's still 2 cop cars in the parking lot." So I went down to tell them, and the female cop kind of rolled her eyes, but the young guy said, "I'll come check it out." They both came back up, looked in the hole, and found a pillow, blankets, cigarettes, clothes, and toothbrushes. This woman had been living in the wall behind my mirror for God knows how long. She had access to me in my room at all times. I know this might be hard to picture, but there was a crawl space around 2 feet wide between the 2 rows of rooms. One of the officers called the original officer to come back and take pictures of this. She explained to him what's going on, and all I hear over the radio is, "No fucking way." He comes back, takes pictures, and is just as mind blown as the rest of us. Obviously, we packed up and left immediately. What's even crazier is she's probably been there for a long time. Last time we stayed at this hotel, I would randomly smell cigarette smoke, and I assumed someone was smoking in their bathroom and it was just traveling through the vents. But nope, it seemed like a junkie was smoking just on the other side of my mirror. She had access to other rooms too. The holes in the walls were from a renovation and the hotel hadn't properly patched it up and just covered it up with mirrors. She could have been hanging out in people's rooms while they were gone too. Anyways, this was insane and I'm taking a little bit of time off. Here's a photo of the hole. And to the lady that was in between the walls, smoking cigarettes and stealing our stuff, let's not meet. This happened maybe 10 years ago when I was in my early 30s. I was standing in line at a local pharmacy to get my prescriptions. This is a small town and I'm a regular there, so they know me on sight. I was behind a couple of other people in line, and there were a couple of people behind me. I kept feeling a tickle in my hair in the back of my head, but every time I looked behind me, the guy there was a few steps back and looking at the floor. This happened several times, so by the time I was at the front of the line, the pharmacist told me she wanted to talk to me about my medication in the consultation room they had at the time. I thought this was weird because we both knew I'd been on this medication for years and would be for life, so nothing new. I get back to the room and I close the door, and she comes in from the door at the other side that leads from the pharmacy. She told me that a man behind me had been stepping forward, sticking his nose in my hair, and smelling, before stepping back and looking at the floor. This shook me pretty badly, as this is such weird behavior, especially in my little town. The pharmacy staff insisted on having me wait there until the guy was distracted, likely by another pharmacy employee, and they had a security guard walk me to my car and watch me drive off to make sure I was gone before the hair sniffer came out and saw what I was driving and what direction I was going in. I still use this pharmacy, and some of the same people still work there. I will always be grateful that they took the initiative to make sure I was safe that day. To the person who is smelling my hair, let's not meet. I'm a girl, and my mom was a horrible addict. She barely took care of me as a kid. At the time of this incident, I was around 6 or 7, so my awareness and understanding of things happening may not totally make much sense. This also happened in the 90s. One night, my mother and I were on a car ride. I wasn't sure why, but it was late at night. I'm not exactly sure what time it was, but I assume it was really late because there weren't many cars on the street and I was sleeping in the back seat. I don't even remember getting in the car. My mom drove up to some sketchy house and left me in the car for what felt like forever. Suddenly, the car doors swung open and someone violently grabbed me by my arm and yanked me out of the car. I started screaming and crying until the man that grabbed me looked me in the eyes and said, "Be quiet and don't try to run or I'll kill you." He had a scruffy beard and he looked like a madman. I was scared to death, so I listened. He held me tight by my arm, shut the car door, and walked with me down the street. I looked back at the house my mom was in, hoping my mom would come out at the last second and save me. I looked at the house as long as I could as a man dragged me further and further away. As we walked down the street, I wanted to cry, but I was in shock and fear. I didn't know what to do. If I sniffled or cried, the man would tighten his grip and yell at me. I couldn't even explain how scared or confused I was. We walked for a little while and ended up in the projects. The projects were a bunch of buildings crammed together in a shitty neighborhood. We walked into one of the buildings and walked up a flight of stairs. My legs and feet hurt like hell, but I was too scared to stop moving or complain. We walked up another flight of stairs when I saw a random guy smoking a cigarette in the stairway. Then, without warning, the guy that kidnapped me fell to the ground. It happened so fast. I didn't know how the kidnapper fell to the ground so fast, but the next thing I remember is the cigarette guy was punching and kicking the kidnapper in his head and face. The kidnapper was out cold. Cigarette guy picked up the kidnapper by the back of his jacket and threw him down the stairs. You have no idea how scary and violent it is to see an unconscious man fall down the stairs. To this day, I still have a fear of falling downstairs. He was bleeding everywhere. I still have no idea how cigarette guy knew to help me out, but I'm glad he did. Maybe he could see tears in my eyes, maybe he just picked up on the fact that something had a bad vibe, but he acted instantly. The first second he could, he attacked my would-be kidnapper. Cigarette guy starts pacing back and forth, swearing at himself, gritting his teeth and clenching his fists. I thought he was mad at me, so I started to cry. He looked at me and said, Okay, shut up. He had an attitude, so I listened to him out of fear. I wasn't as scared of the cigarette guy as much as the bearded guy, but I was still in fear of him. He started to ask me questions with an attitude. Why are you out this late? Where are your parents? Why would you talk to strangers? I was in so much shock and confusion I couldn't answer the man's questions correctly. He asked if I knew my way home, and I told him I didn't. I told him a broken story about what happened, and somehow with that information I gave, he knew where my mom's car was. The only thing I remember about the road is passing a house with Christmas lights on it, despite Christmas already being over. I think he knew the area well enough and figured out where I needed to go. But honestly, I don't even remember telling him about the Christmas lights. Anyways, he told me he would take me back if I promised over and over again that I wouldn't tell the police that I saw him or anyone that looked like him, and made me promise that I wouldn't tell the police anything. He had an attitude, and I didn't care what he asked me. I just wanted to go back to my mom, so I agreed. I followed him down the stairs. The bearded guy was laying on the ground, bleeding at the bottom of the stairs that cigarette guy threw him down. He wasn't moving at all. For all I knew, he could have been dead. And I hope now that he was. Cigarette Guy stepped over the bearded guy and I followed. We walked outside and Cigarette Guy looked around all panicky. I remember him telling me, "The police don't like me." We walked out of the projects and my feet still hurt. Cigarette Guy was walking fast in a panic and I had to basically jog to keep up with him. I started crying and he asked me what was wrong and I told him that my feet hurt, and I remember him sucking his teeth and picking me up with an attitude. He awkwardly cradled me in both arms. He walked down the road for a moment, then I remember him swearing and running behind a house or a building. A cop car was driving down the road. He put me down and told me to run to the police car. I tried to run, but my legs could barely move at this point, and I was terrified. The cop car kept driving down the road without seeing me before I could even get remotely close to it. He kept swearing to himself as he picked me up again and ran down the street. He took me behind a lot of houses and hid from every cop that drove by. I assumed now that the police were looking for me. He carried me in both arms, running fast down the road when I saw my mom in her car in the distance. She was surrounded by police. Cigarette Guy put me down and told me to run to the police. I got so excited the pain in my legs disappeared. He put me down and ran away. I ran towards the police and my mom. My mom picked me up and hugged me tight. The police started to ask me and my mom questions. I don't remember too much about their questions, but I remember my mom telling the police some convoluted story that just didn't make any sense. She basically told me not to say anything, and I didn't say much but cried a whole bunch. We went home. Days later, my dad picked me up and knew something was wrong. I told him everything, and from that point on, I never lived with my mom again. When I grew up, I had time to think about that day, and I never forgave my mother. Not too long ago, I asked my dad what he remembers about the situation, and he told me what he thinks happened from what I explained to him from years ago. He said my mom was on a drug binge, I got kidnapped, someone saved me, but the person that saved me had warrants and wasn't mad at me. He was just frustrated with the whole situation that he had to deal with. Imagine being a criminal on the run, and now you have a kidnapped girl with you, and you just beat a guy half to death. If he would have gotten caught with me, he could have gone to jail for my kidnapping. With my mom lying and me being in shock and confused, I wouldn't be able to tell them that the man helped me because while it was all happening, I didn't even notice he was helping me. To the man that saved me, thanks. To the man that tried to kidnap me, let's not meet. This happened around 2 days ago. I live in a small city in Romania, around 30,000 inhabitants. Romania isn't exactly known for their tolerance of gay people. It's not as bad as other places, such as Russia, but the situation is definitely not rosy here either. I get on Grindr and meet a guy, 18 years old apparently. The guy didn't have a picture of his face as his profile picture, because it's too dangerous. He had a picture of a rose drawing. Most guys on Grindr here don't have any pictures of themselves. We talked for a bit and I really liked the guy. And then we finally accept to exchange face pictures. I sent him a selfie of myself and he sends me a picture of a guy from our city. He was cute and I really liked him, so I told him, "Hey, I saw you around the city. Didn't know you were gay too." We talked and finally arranged to meet. I had some errands to run at the tailor shop. My cousin's bachelorette party is coming next week and I need to adjust my favorite shirt. So I asked him to meet me in the front of the tailor shop. The building in which the tailor shop is located has 4 stories. The ground floor is a clothes shop, which my aunt works at. The first floor is a storage room. The 3rd floor is a barber salon, and the 4th floor was a tailor shop. I go to the tailor shop, and then go to the clothes shop on the ground floor to visit my aunt and see how she's doing. As I was looking out the window of the clothes shop, I noticed there were 5 men, all of them looking to be about in their late 20s behind the building. None of them was the guy I got a picture of, and none of them even looked remotely close to what the guy looked like. I texted the guys I was supposed to meet and asked him if he made it to the tailor shop. As soon as I sent the message, one of the 5 guys' phones lit up, and he started texting. As soon as he stopped texting, I got a notification from Grindr. "I'm behind the tailor shop. I went there to smoke so no one would see me. Come smoke with me." I was terrified as I realized I wasn't going to meet the guy in the picture. He tries to get me to go behind the tailor shop, and I try to get him to go to the side of it. There were no windows to the side of the building, so after a few tries, He agreed to meet at the side of the tailor shop. All 5 guys went to the side of the tailor shop. I peeked my head from the door, looked left and right, and as soon as I saw my way was clear, I ran for it. So Grinder cutie, let's not meet. This story comes from no other than the person you're hearing right now, myself. I had quite the cannabis habit. I would smoke every day for months on end. But one day, around 7 months into my cannabis binge, I decided enough was enough, and I had stopped. From this point on, life started to get better, I started to feel happier, and I was using it less and less. You may be wondering why you need to know this to understand this story. Well, the events of this night all take place because I went out to smoke with one of my friends before he moved away for college. Now I was around a month clean at this point, but smoking was just something my friend group did, and I surely wanted to enjoy one last time with my friend before he left, so that's what we did. Me and a few of my friends, including the friend who moved away, all got together to smoke weed. Now my other friends, they kept smoking every single day, so I was obviously way more high than them. Anyways, it was getting late at this point, around 11 p.m., and so we all made our ways back home. My friend had driven my car back to his house around 30 minutes away because I still didn't feel okay to drive. After he got out of my car and went into his house, I got into the driver's seat and I decided to pull out of his house. Now everything was going smoothly at this point and I was definitely alert enough to drive. So I'm a few miles down from his house at this point and the road takes a sharp left. So naturally, I turn my car with the road and I see a ton of flashing lights. Shit. At first I assumed it was cops or something, maybe they had set up a checkpoint, and at this point I started to get a little worried. Sure, I was fine to drive and everything, but my eyes were still red like hell. So I'm driving up to whatever these flashing lights are and I get a little closer and I proceed to see somebody doing CPR to somebody else on the road. Nope. At this point I decided to back my car up because I assumed there was an accident and EMS was already there. As I'm reversing my car, I take a double take and I realize that there is no EMS. The flashing lights I was seeing was hazards on somebody's car, and to the side of the road, a truck with its hazards and brights on. So I pull my car over and park in a ditch, really the only place I could park on this road, and I get out. I walk up to the truck first as it was closer to my car. There's a man on the phone. I look back down the road and I still see the same guy performing CPR on an unconscious person. I signaled to the guy near the truck, who I was standing next to at this point, and asked him if he wanted me to call the police. He very frantically shook his head. And I did just that. I called 911 and at first they couldn't hear me. As they're trying to get an answer out of me, repeatedly asking if I'm there, I hear the man performing CPR on the unconscious guy say, "You're my best friend. Come on, you can't leave me like this." At this point I'm screaming at the operator on the other end, and yet they still can't hear me. So finally they hang up the call and I'm in absolute rage. They call me back and finally they can hear me, and I explain the road I'm on and that there appears to be an unconscious man and somebody doing CPR on him. After this occurs, I hang up the phone and me and the guy in the truck and his wife start walking up to the person doing CPR on the unconscious body. As we're walking, he tells me that he was from a city around an hour away from us and that he was only in my town to celebrate a certain type of festival. We live in Louisiana, so having festivals over shrimp and seafood and stuff like that is kind of commonplace here. So we walk up, and I'm about a foot away from this guy doing CPR on the unconscious body. We try to ask him what's up, and that's when I look up and I see his car totally demolished. I'm surprised the hazards even worked on the car with all the damage that had been done to it. He starts rambling frantically, in a panic. He mentions something about a horse, but at this point it's just too hard to understand what he's saying. He's clearly getting tired at this point, and he asked me to switch out with him. So I did. I get on top of this unconscious body, put my hands on his chest, and start performing compressions. All while his friend is saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, stay in a line, stay in a line. Whatever little bit of high I was feeling on the drive back left me at this moment. I felt completely sober. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or what, but even that tired feeling that you get towards the end of the high whenever you're not really high anymore off weed, that wasn't there either. I was just fully alert. It's kind of hard to explain. The man's body who I was performing compressions on was very badly injured. His entire chest appeared to be sideways at a 45-degree angle, and there was what looked to be bloody pieces of pulp all over him. As I'm looking at his face, I realize there's dried blood that had already dried out that came out of his mouth. The man at this point begins to explain what happened. He was driving his car down the road with his friend in the passenger seat when a horse ran out and struck their car. By this point, we had already switched out of doing the compressions a couple times, and I'm looking at his car and I realize that his side is not nearly as badly damaged as the passenger side. I think what had happened was that the horse hit the car and slid into the passenger side and then flew out the top after. It would explain all of that bloody pulp stuff that was all over the guy I was doing compressions on, but I can't really be sure. A police officer was the first one to arrive to the scene. He switches out with me and starts doing compressions on the guy. Then eventually he gets tired and he switches out with the driver who had gotten in the car accident. Then, a short while later, the fire department are the next people to arrive. They come out and they're hooking up some sort of machinery to him and checking his pulse, which there's none. I don't really know what overcame me, but seeing all this, I just screamed out "fuck" really loud. Then finally, an ambulance arrives. They're carrying out a stretcher and some other stuff they needed to check his vitals. A paramedic starts trying to perform CPR on him, and after a while they realize it's not working. Now the stretcher was back around 6 or 7 feet from them, and I was standing right next to it. "Bring it here," one says. I didn't really react, and he says it again a little bit louder. So I realized he was talking to me. I grab the stretcher and I bring it close to them. Then we all coordinate how we're gonna pick up his body, and me, these paramedics, the fire department, and this police officer all help pick up his body and put him on the stretcher. When people are involved in these kind of accidents, it's very complicated the way you have to move them, because moving them just a slight bit can give them lifelong injuries, so I understood why we all had to help. Well, after they got him onto the stretcher, they moved him back into the ambulance and they drove away. The cop asked for my name alongside the guy and his wife who were in the truck. We respectfully give him our names and he thanks us and he tells us to wait for the sheriff department to get there so they can decide what to do with us. He said they may have needed a statement or something. Then, a short while later, a sheriff's officer pulls up in her car. She gets out, she talks to us, grabs our names, and then asks for the story. We tell her what the guy had said to us frantically and how he had explained that a horse had hit their car. And then me, this man and his wife, and the sheriff start all looking around for this horse. There are a few more police officers at this point, and everybody's just looking for this horse. So me, the wife, the husband, and the sheriff were walking around, and we see a large dark object in a ditch. The sheriff's officer clicks her flashlight on to look at whatever was in this ditch, and there it was, a giant, dead horse. She then looks back at us, shines a flashlight at our feet because we were all standing near this ditch, and she says, "Y'all might not want to stand there." I look down, and there's just a ton of horse pulp and guts everywhere. After that, we were free to go, and still, very freaked out, I called one of my friends to tell him what had just happened to me. I get home, I washed my ring off on my finger, which still had a little bit of dried pulp or blood on it or something. Then I went to bed. This experience kind of messed me up for a few days, but after I was able to recover from it and move on. The last thing I did was find the person's Facebook, who I was helping give compressions to his friend, and gave my condolences. He had plans for me. So yesterday I was at my sister's house with my mom, watching my son and nephews play in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off a tree, and I remembered an odd encounter I had as a kid. I said, "So weird," out loud, thinking about the encounter. My mom, of course being nearby, heard this and asked me what I was thinking about. So I told her. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at Pinecone Forest, which is what the neighborhood kids would call a small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off of one of the trees to pass some time, waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework to come out and play. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a guy came up to me. I could smell him before I saw him. He reeked of stale cigarette smoke. I was kind of afraid when I looked at him. He wasn't very old, but he had a very lazy eye that was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mom taught me to be nice to people, even if they don't look like me, so I faked a smile and said hello. "What are you doing?" he asked me. The smell of his breath was the worst. I'm picking the bark off this tree." "You shouldn't do that. It's like picking off the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?" he said while lightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow nails. "I don't know," I replied and took my arm back. Just then, Frankie's mom called for me out the door and told me to come wait inside. I didn't think anything of the whole thing at the time, and when I told my mom about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe? She said it's probably time I know the whole story. She had thought I forgot about the whole encounter, so she never brought it up to me. Firstly, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in is a tight-knit community. There's also not very many people in our neighborhood either. Everyone knew everyone, and there was no reason for an outsider to come unless they knew someone there. Anyway, here's what happened with this guy. Frankie's mom, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. She didn't recognize it but figured maybe it was a visitor for a neighbor. Sonia said, or rather told the police, that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of keeping an eye on it, She said she just had a very bad feeling about the whole thing. Her house had a huge window in the front facing the pinecone forest, and the van was parked right next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van while holding the phone just in case. She saw the man exit the back of the van, walk up to me, and as soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops. And then shortly after that was when she called me back into her house. The cops stopped the guy just outside of my neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at school, my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mom, just me everywhere I went. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him. Inside the unit they found a cabinet full of knives. A lot of knives. Paring knives, a butcher cleaver, a thin fillet knife, a melon baller, and just various knives of all shapes and sizes. There was also a few anatomy books, surgical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, so it had wrist and ankle straps. The entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrap. My mom said that he was in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane, last she heard. So the whole thing's pretty creepy to me, and I figured I'd share my story. The office in the middle of nowhere. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically, what you did was you'd tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you'd go and do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but the pay was good, and as long as you had some friends around you, it wasn't that bad of a job. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. I was told it covered roughly the same landmass as the state of Maryland in the United States. About 9 hours from Sydney City, and the property itself was around 40 minutes from the nearest town. In short, it was in the middle of nowhere. I was working at a farm cleaning brushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy named Jeremy who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. He was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot, and the work was hard. So one day when the temperature hit around 38 degrees Celsius, around 100 Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a water hole on the farm, about a 25-minute drive north. I was very keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the arvo. So him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide, empty expanses with a few clumps of scattered brushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. "Did you see that over there? Beneath the 2 dead trees?" I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red, and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed. I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously didn't. He said he hadn't seen it when we drove through the same area around 5 weeks before, but he wanted to go and check out what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, yeah, it was definitely something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I completely understood, given it was his property. But in truth, I was really anxious. As we got closer, things seemed more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side. Both the cameras seemed motion activated, so they all buzzed from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, "With all this security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go." He brushed me off, however, reminding me that it was his farm and whoever had put this here was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. We had some bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of a struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was a rush of cold air as we got in. The place was air conditioned, which I must admit was quite pleasant on such a hot day. We searched around for a light switch, but I could already see this was some sort of IT setup. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and the sort of hum you hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered, office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges, and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, and plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall. and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. This made absolutely no sense. We wandered to the middle and sat down at the desks to see if the computers could give us any idea of what the hell was going on here. My heart was racing and I honestly just wanted to bolt. We had been seen by the CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring us, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, on the other hand, was adamant that we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it from my lay position is that it was an endless list of computer talk. On the computer screen, there looked to be some sort of program that looked similar to Napster or LimeWire. You know, just some sort of downloading program. Just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over to the far end of the container, to a big pile of storage boxes. By then I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided against my better judgment to see what was inside all these boxes. My brief sift through these boxes made me feel sick to my stomach. It didn't take long for me to realize that these boxes were full of posters, DVDs, and photos. All of hardcore, let's just call it cheese pizza. One thing that gets to me is that it was all neatly ordered into folders and smaller boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up, and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I said something to the effect of, "Mate, get out. Child's go. Get the fuck up." I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back into the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile phone reception, and we hadn't brought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline and call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which is in a town around half an hour from the town closest to the farm. As I mentioned, we were in a very remote place. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives, and we jumped in and led them back. This is where things get worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open and there was a fire inside. We only had 2 extinguishers in the car, and these did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, by which stage most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This means that whoever ran this operation knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was absolutely huge, so there was no real way to tell them. Since the police hadn't taken all of us too seriously in the first instance, probably due to the poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was also impossible by the time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who may be responsible, the investigation went cold. I kept my contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still sitting there on the farm, as it's way too expensive to move. I'll never forget about what I saw in those boxes. Okay, so before you go and call me a complete asshole, you should know my wife, Stacy. Stacy has pulled some seriously fucked up pranks in the past. Like last August, after my mom got hit by an 18-wheeler, she secretly signed up for a ventriloquism lesson so that during the funeral she could throw her voice and yell, "Get me out of here, I'm still alive, damn it," while the pallbearers lowered the casket. Or, there was also that time she tricked me into thinking I'd won the lottery. That alone I might have laughed off, except she also convinced me to call my very married asshole boss and tell him the whole department knows he fucked his secretary at the office Christmas party. So I'd been looking for a little payback, and I knew just the way to get it. Just last week, Stacy came down with a ferocious migraine, and 3 days in bed with a damp rag across her head didn't help one bit, so off to the hospital we went. From across the desk in his cramped office, Dr. Mercer said that she needed a brain scan. He also suggested that, in his professional opinion, we should brace ourselves for the worst. Time slowed down and we waited for the diagnosis. Adrift and forlorn, we held each other for hours on end while the seconds tickled down by the clock above the mantelpiece. Sure, my wife kept a brave face, but anytime she returned from her solo walks, her eyes would be all red and puffed out. Well, this morning Dr. Mercer finally called while Stacy was at the store. He used a landline because she hadn't answered on her mobile. "So what's the diagnosis?" I asked, with my stomach folding itself in knots. Again and again, he insisted that he couldn't discuss the case with anyone besides the patient. But after 10 minutes of begging him on the phone, I was finally able to get an answer out of him. He sighed, lowered his voice, then said he had a hunch Stacy and I would have cause for celebration this Valentine's Day. It seemed that all the joy and all the feeling that was taken out of me had come back into the world. I thanked the doctor, hung up, and screamed in happiness. But as I was sitting there in the kitchen, just right by the landline phone, an idea popped into my head. Stacy had always pranked me, and I mean, sure, I never really pranked her back, so this was a perfect time. Soon I heard Little Miss Loves to Prank come through the front door, kick off her shoes, and shuffle along the hall. As she stepped into the room, I looked up without saying a single word. A hand shot up over her mouth. I swallowed a gulp, then, in a thin, weak voice, I said, "Dr. Mercer called." "Is it bad?" she responded. Rather than answer, I simply pretended to sob into my hands. Stacy didn't burst into tears or scream, nor did she collapse on the floor. Instead, she let out a deep sigh and threw her head back. On the wall beside the window stood a dark wooden cabinet. She went over to it, slid open the bottom drawer, and lifted out this huge metal trunk. I stood up. "Everything okay?" The trunk had a combination lock. Once Stacy rolled the numbers into place, the latch opened with a little click. "Do you love me?" she asked over her shoulder. Still in character, I said, "Of course I love you. I'll always love you. And we're gonna get and drink this." She spun around, holding a bottle of whiskey. I craned my neck to peek inside the trunk and glimpsed a pair of handcuffs and a red bow tie before she blocked my view. "I bought it for a special occasion," she said. I stepped forward, arms outstretched. "Listen, no matter what, we're gonna get through this mess together. Just drink it," she snapped. "Please, it's important. If you love me, you'll drink it." Was this a joke? I searched her face for answers, finding none, but hell, who was I to judge? Everyone processes grief in their own individual way. "Sure, honey." I grabbed the bottle from her and took a long swig. My insides already warming. 5 seconds later, the floor rose up to meet me. Darkness swallowed the lounge and everything in it. My next memory is of the words, "I love you," drifting towards me from the end of a long tunnel. There was a pressure inside my skull. I tried moving it, but couldn't. My hands had been cuffed behind my back. My ankles were bound together by the length of a rope. I was propped up on a sofa in a tux. Through the haze, I saw two Stacys orbit one another, both wearing her favorite dress, the red one she had worn to all of our anniversaries. In her right hand, she had a pistol. God, where did that come from? Her voice echoed on and on as she told me she prepared for this day years ago, that she couldn't bear the thought of me carrying on without her and starting a new family. Although I dipped in and out of consciousness, the words, "we have to go together," kept stinging my ears. I thrashed around, unable to speak. The best my drooling mouth could manage was slurred, random syllables. Stacy sat beside me and pressed her right temple against my left. The pistol angled in such a way that one shot would tear through both of our frontal lobes. Oh fuck. Did she plan on killing us? My attempts to beg her to wait came out as a nonsensical gurgle. Squeezing those beautiful green eyes of hers shut, Stacy said, "Goodbye, Frank. I love you so, so much." By now, enough of the brain fog had lifted so I could mutter, It was a prank." She stopped breathing, tensed up. "What?" I took several quick, short breaths. "It's just a prank. Dr. Mercer said you'd be fine, so I set you up as payback for the lottery thing." For almost a minute, neither of us said a word, the room thick with tension. Then, forcing a smile, she said, "Well, duh." She stood. "Did you really think I was gonna kill both of us? I knew you were full of crap the second I walked in. You're the worst actor in the world. I just turned the prank around on you. Ha ha ha." The way she said this, every word steeped in sincerity, made the statement swing all the way back towards Hollow. She crossed the room and slipped the gun into the trunk before returning with a key to unlock my cuffs. "Well, that's a relief about the diagnosis. We should celebrate. How about we order Thai tonight?" After she loosened the rope, I got up, rubbing my chafed wrists, my vision blurred, and my throat dry. "Sounds great. Perfect," she said with a smile, stood on her tiptoes, lifted my chin with a finger, gave me a quick kiss, and then disappeared into the kitchen. My shirt was a drenched rag against my chest. Had it really been a prank? Surely drugging me was a step too far, even for her. Just then, the phone wailed. It sounded painfully loud inside my aching skull. Dr. Mercer was on the line, and this time, his voice carried a distinct sour note. "Frank, I'm really sorry, but there's been a mix-up with the results. Can you have Stacy call me as soon as possible? It's urgent." The room shifted from side to side, the ground shifting and morphing beneath my feet. My better half came up through the door and said, "Who was that, honey?" I hung up and swallowed the lump in my throat. Wrong number. A package marked "Return to Sender." My neighbor is one of those annoying wannabe YouTube personalities. Over the years, I've seen him cough out cinnamon, lay flat on the hood of his car as it slowly creeps down the driveway, and douse himself with lukewarm water. all while screaming epic win, epic fail, or fuck, maybe even epic maintenance for the status quo, for all I know. It can get pretty tiring to watch him go about his shenanigans in the pursuit of viral fame, so when he knocked on my door the other day and told me he was going away for a few weeks and asked if I could get his mail, honestly, it was a relief. I can't explain the peace of mind I had knowing I didn't have to brace myself for any of his stupidity for a while. I always feared his stupid shenanigans would somehow wind up bleeding over into my life. Things were pretty normal for the first couple of days. He received a few bills, a bit of spam, and what I could only assume was a birthday card. Then, one evening, I got home to find a cardboard box waiting on his front porch. In big red letters was written, "Return to Sender." I'm no small fry, but I admit I had trouble lifting the box on my own. This thing was really frickin' heavy. Lugging it across the road to my house was even harder, and I quickly realized there was no way I was going to drag it up the stairs through my front door. I decided I'd leave his package in my garage. It wasn't like I kept my car there. The garage door was a piece of shit that refused to open without a good thug or whack. It was less trouble leaving the car in the driveway than it was to fight with the garage door every morning and night. In hindsight, I should have set that package down while I struggled to open the tricky door, but you know how it is whenever you've got a good grip on something. No point in setting it down if you don't have to. As I kicked my front door for the first time, I lost my grip on the package and it fell to the ground. I even heard a slight little crack inside. Shit, I hope I hadn't broken anything important, but I figured I just wouldn't tell my neighbor about it and let him assume the break happened en route. Hands free, I finally managed to get the garage door unstuck, and boy did it screech in protest as it rolled up over me. I dragged the box the rest of the way, setting it in the corner for whenever my neighbor would come back to claim it, and then I forgot all about it, until a few days passed, that is. I'm not sure exactly how long it took for the smell to waft in from the crack under the garage to house door, but it came in slow progression. It was a sticky sweet odor similar to that of a skunk, and for the first few days after I smelled it, I genuinely assumed that's exactly what it was. Roadkill that had left its mark on my house. It was only when I realized the scent was growing more intense instead of fading that I went and looking for the source. That's when I opened the garage door, and that's when the odor knocked me back. The culprit wasn't hard to identify. Practically the only thing I had in my garage was that stupid box laying in the corner. I remember thinking it must have been one of those meat of the month subscription boxes. The meat must have gone rancid for being left out of the fridge for so long. How much meat could have been in there for the box to have been so large and heavy? An entire freaking cow? I covered my nose as I approached the box, a pair of scissors in my hands. I probably wouldn't have needed them to open it, as it has become less soggy enough at the bottom to poke through with a finger, but I wasn't about to poke my finger through spoiled meat juices. The soggy bottom was the reason I had opened the box in the first place. If I tried to drag it out whole, everything would spill onto the floor. I was going to have to dump the pieces of meat one garbage bag at a time and take them down to the dumpster, a process I was not looking forward to. My scissors tore through the tape alongside the top of the cardboard box. I thought the smell couldn't get any worse, but as I flipped the flaps open, I discovered a whole new gamut of stink. It was like opening a burning oven, but instead of a heat wave, I was met with waves of piss, sweat, shit, and putrefaction. It was so bad that I staggered back and had to force down the puke begging to guzzle out of me. I don't think I could have handled that scent mingling with the horrors coming out of the box. I'm not ashamed to admit, I ran out of the door for a fresh breath of air. But in the short time I'd spent in the garage, the smell had become so ingrained in the fabric of my clothes that it clung to me like a shadow. Nothing I tried could keep the smell out of my nostrils. Not air fresheners, not a face mask, not 3 showers and a change of clothes. Every second that box lay open in my garage was another second the smell was allowed a foothold in my home. I had to bite the bullet. I returned to the garage, the flaps of the box still open, as though inviting me to look. I was prepared, a clothespin pinning my nostrils shut, a garbage bag in one hand, and the strongest cleaner I could find in the other, and finally, some long rubber gloves to keep my skin from having to touch what was inside. But as it turns out, I needed none of those things. I wouldn't have to touch or clean the contents of the box. I would only have to suffer the nightmares every night. You see, there was meat in that box, but it didn't come from a cow or pig. No, it was worse than that. It was my neighbor, dead. Still in one piece, but dead. I called the cops, and naturally, they took me in for interrogation. It's kind of hard not to suspect the man with a corpse in his garage after all. Thankfully, they soon realized I wasn't involved. My DNA might have been all over that box. The smell might have left a mask throughout my house, but there was one piece of irrefutable evidence in my neighbor's own hands that proved my innocence. A vlogging camera. They showed me the footage only once. I'm not even sure if they were allowed to, or if they felt so bad for me they figured it couldn't hurt. Either way, I saw it. My neighbor was sitting in a box outside of a shipping facility, laughing as he told the world how he was going to mail himself across state lines. He'd bought pee bottles, food, a pillow, and a few flashlights. His friend, a guy I'd seen at his place several times to help out with his stunts, closed the lid and presumably dropped him off for shipment. Throughout the next couple of hours, or days, I'm honestly not sure, my neighbor had recorded a few short clips of his progress. "I think I'm in a truck now. I can feel it moving. Must be in a warehouse. Pretty warm in here. Still got plenty of food." That kind of stuff. And then, on the last entry, the box toppled over, he broke his neck, and that was it. The camera recorded until either the memory card got too full or the battery died. There's one thing I didn't tell the police after they showed me the video. One thing I heard in the footage that will haunt me to the day I died. Just after the tumble that broke his neck, I heard the familiar screeching sound of my garage door. I live below a cult leader and I fear I've angered her. I, 28 female, have lived in the same apartment for 4 years. My neighbors in the unit above me are a couple in their 30s who have lived there for about 3 years with no issues between us. During the past 6 months, I've noticed changes in their behaviors. At first it was just a few days per week. I'd hear music with heavy bass accompanied by rhythmic jumping. I assumed they just bought like an exercise bike or something. But sometimes the jumping gets so intense that it shakes my overhead light fixtures. The jumping routine has been escalating to the point that it takes place every single day, normally between 8 AM and 10 AM. I also noticed that they called 1-800-JUNK and got rid of a lot of nice possessions. However, I figured this was none of my business, so I kept my observations to myself. About 3 weeks ago, everything escalated. Multiple times per week, on weekdays and during working hours. It sounds like they're hosting a mini Burning Man event in their apartment. The music is so loud and clear that it sounds as if I'm at a concert while sitting in my living room. There's clearly a lot of people involved because the jumping/stomping shakes multiple light fixtures and cabinets. And a male voiceover giving weird instructions like rebrand yourself, surround yourself, with stomping oftentimes accompanying these phrases. I've taken audio recordings on my phone and one video from the hallway during these events. I still didn't complain to the building, but I wanted evidence in case it became a regular thing. This week I encountered a big problem. The couple above me has a private patio, which is directly above my bedroom. I came home from a 3-day trip out of town yesterday, and my ceiling is legitimately collapsing in one corner. Big chunks of plaster had fallen to the ground, and I even saw a little water. I immediately called my superintendent since I didn't want to be buried alive by ceiling rubble if it gives out. When he came to check it out, he was shocked and pissed. He said that the woman in the couple appears to be working with some people, doing workshops or something. He could see their patio from his apartment window and watch the group do these dancing plus jumping plus rituals out there. He said they all dance and jump to the music and then spread dirt along with something else, quote unquote, he doesn't know what it is, across the patio on a weekly basis. He believes that the dirt plus the unknown substance combo is getting through the wood cracks, absorbing water, and weighing down my ceiling. In order to fix the problem, my super said he would have to go talk to the woman, check out their patio, and ultimately hire a contractor to pull up the wood to scrape out whatever the hell was causing my ceiling to fall. I could hear them talking from my room, and the woman sounded very distraught and offensive. When my super left, he called me and warned me that she might try to come down to my apartment and demand to see the damage, but don't let her in. This was all a little concerning to me. Is she a threat? I mean, the damage is real and I wouldn't mind showing her. She started playing music again relatively loud, kind of like a warning shot, it almost seemed. I mentioned the music and jumping to the super and stated that I have audio recordings. He started begging me to send the evidence to the front office. It sounds like he wanted them evicted as soon as possible. I happily agreed, and I hate to be a rat, but if I have to choose sides, I'll side with the building that dictates my annual rent price. He called me twice more that afternoon to confirm that I shared my evidence, and I said yes. Shortly after everything went down, I left my apartment to run an errand. The woman was outside just standing on the sidewalk and stared at me the whole time as I walked by. I ignored her, and this isn't my fault. Now today, I went to run another quick errand in the neighborhood, and when I returned, the couple was standing again on the sidewalk, both of them this time, followed me into the building, and then waited until I was opening my apartment door to confront me. They were both wearing creepy fake smiles. The woman has horse girl hair down to her waist and stared and interrogated me. They asked, "Is your ceiling really collapsing? When did it start? Do you think it was related to the recent rainfall? Because our patio is just fine." I was a little uncomfortable. Were they waiting for me outside? How did they even know I had left the building? Why were they both standing there? I've literally never seen them enter together in their 3 years of living here, but I've had nothing to hide, so I confirm the damage is pretty bad. I just don't want it to fall during the winter. Sorry for the inconvenience, but hopefully the work will be done quickly for everyone's sake. They seem satisfied enough, so I said have a good day and shut my door. I'm getting to sense that they're nervous about what the contractors will find when they tear open their patio. What the fuck is up with all the dirt rituals? Who are these people she's quote unquote working with? I don't know what they look like or why they're available to stomp around on weekdays. The repair work has already started on both sides, but the contractors will come in on Wednesday for the grand reveal of what's under the patio that's making my ceiling collapse. In the meantime, I feel like I need to be alert and keep my eyes out for these people, as well as the couple. It's unusual for me to see them in general, especially twice in 2 days, and they seem scared and in denial of the problem. They also literally ambushed me, so hopefully it's all over soon. Update. The contractors came today and reported that there was, in fact, quote-unquote dirt and sludge visible below the neighbor's patio. However, thanks to my help of my internet sleuthing friend, I've gained a lot more insight into the realm that dwells above me. As one Redditor suggested, my neighbor is affiliated with multiple ecstatic dance communities, both international and local. The international group has planned events during which all cells of the organization host dance sessions simultaneously. It also has a YouTube channel that streams psych trance music 24/7. I listened to a portion of it and a female voiceover declared, "You are becoming the great game master." Meanwhile, the local groups seem to be more exclusive and more radical in their mindset. One of the local groups, hosted by my neighbor's good friend, conducts 3-day events that cost upwards of $400 for admission. Participation in all 3 days is mandatory. I get the impression they all sleep in the studio space, and the event description mentions that it begins with a ritual. The last and darkest affiliation that I have confirmed via social media footprints is that my neighbor and a few members of the local communities are also involved with some compassionate death group. There's no way for me to verify this at this time if these affiliations overlap in a meaningful way, so I will simply state the facts that I have evidence to prove. My super asked me about the jumping again when I saw him today. He remains eager to act, and he agreed with me. My new game plan is to wait for another large event to happen, then call him to quote-unquote check on my dishwasher so he can intervene. So for now, the ways in which the puzzle pieces of ecstatic dance, compassionate death, patio, dirt, rituals, and ceiling collapse connect will remain a mystery. My roommate in his Cat in the Hat costume. It was the 1st of November and he was still wearing it. Our party was on the 29th of October and it was funny then. Hell, even on the 30th it still made me laugh when I saw him occasionally creep out of his room to stock up on snacks from the kitchen. When I left the house for my 9 a.m. class on the 31st, and he was sitting in the kitchen in his Cat in the Hat costume still on, well, then I began to worry. John was quiet at the best of times, not too many friends, and I wasn't a stranger to sitting in silence at meal times. This was different though. His unnerving smile was all I could really see of his face beneath his prosthetics and makeup. It didn't help that it was a shitty homemade costume either. Visible stitching and discolored tufts of fur made it all the creepier. Our other flatmate had dropped out at the start of the semester, so it was just John and I for a long time. He wasn't inherently a weird guy before this either. Quiet, yes, but friendly enough. "Don't you have classes to go to?" I asked as I left for work on the 2nd. He silently shook his head, not looking up from the book he was reading. "Starting to get a real fucking creepy feeling around here, man," I muttered loud enough for him to hear as I shut the door behind it. "I like it." I heard John bark with venom from the driveway. It was the night of the 3rd when I finally cracked and phoned his sister. The white patches of the soup were beginning to yellow and there was an awful stench permeating around the house. She thought I was kidding at first, but after I explained in detail what had been going on the last few days, she went quiet. She assured me that he had been texting her regularly as he did, but he never got around to mentioning the costume. I'd known the guy for a little over a year at this point, but I didn't really know that much about him. His sister told me that he'd been obsessed with Cat in the Hat after he'd seen the movie in the cinema when he was around 8 or 9, but grew out of that phase fairly quickly. She assured me that she'd phone him and get to the bottom of whatever the hell was going on. It was the smell that woke me up. That's how pungent it was. "Don't meddle me with my affairs," John said, standing in the doorway with the dim light behind him which partially illuminated that fucking costume. "What the hell? Get out of here, you freak," I shouted in a panicked daze. "Don't meddle me with my affairs," he said again. His tone was calm, but there was a definite aggression behind it. He lingered there for a few more seconds, a silent tension between us. It was one of the few times in my life I'd ever felt genuine terror as I gazed at that horrendous cat costume and my roommate beneath it. The next day in class, I was going through my options in my head. My other friends had recommended calling the cops and that John was in need of some serious help. I didn't want to get him into some kind of trouble though, maybe even sanctioned. My choice was made for me when the two police detectives pulled me out of the lecture. They sat me down in the cafeteria with a stern look upon their faces. My first thought was that John had killed himself. I didn't know why, but that made the most sense to me at the time. I was dead wrong. Why didn't you report that he was missing? Did you not find it odd for him to not come? One quizzed me. He is missing? He should be there right now. Probably still wearing that stupid costume. A dog walker had discovered John's naked body in the bushes not too far from my house. The police reckoned he had been dead since the night of the 29th. They never found anyone in the house during their search, only that tattered costume which had been neatly folded on the top of my bed. Miss Marnie's Tea House. You're going to hell, child of Satan. You'll burn in agony just like the Jews and heads. God will cast thee down to Gehenna. Burn, witch. That's how I used to begin my morning. Every morning. I live in the same little townhouse that my mother lived in, and her mother before her. And for as long as I can remember, we've lived next to Miss Thompson, who is perhaps the nastiest person I've ever met. Her voice has assaulted my ears since childhood. Either she was yelling at my mother or antagonizing me while I played outside. I don't know how she came to the conclusion that we're witches, but no matter how kind we were to her, her words were always the same. Die, burn in hell, Satan spawn, witches, bitches. So every morning I'd walk to my car amid her screaming and try to tune it out as I prepared for the day. After all, it's no good coming into work at a tea house when you're stressed. Your foul mood will poison the tea. At least, that's what my mother always taught me. Just like our home, the tea house had been in my family for generations. It is owned and managed by a woman, and we never take employees. They just aren't really needed. Besides, it's hard to teach a newcomer the finer points of tea making. Me? I've been studying tea since I was a child, as my mother passed down her secrets to me. It's a wonderful job, a wonderful life, and I quite enjoy it. All except for Miss Thompson, of course. Every morning at the tea house was the same. I began by rinsing out the cast iron teapot and teacups. You can't use soap on them, you know, and you can't wash the outside. You can only rinse them, and over time they'll take on the flavor of the teas you brew in them, which is why I have a separate tea set for each kind of tea. Green, black, yellow, oolong, white, and herbal infusions. I set the metal teapots down to brew hot water on the stove. You can't put cast iron on the stove either. While prepping the water, I'd select the teas I would feature that day. Of course, a customer can come in and request any kind of tea they like, but I always like to give my own recommendations. I would open the store at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'd spend the day serving tea. I had quite a few regulars come in that enjoyed the healing properties of tea. People with stomach problems who liked jade mint oolong, people with anxiety who preferred the chamomile blossom, and people who simply enjoyed the traditional taste and brewing process of matcha. Well, one morning, someone new came into the tea house. Someone I never expected to see. Jamie Thompson. Miss Thompson's grandson, who had spent most of his time caring for the aging crony, was standing in the front of my tea house, watching me serve mango black tea to a few elderly tourists looking for something sweet and strong. "Miss Marnie, I see your tea house is doing well," he began. I noticed the elderly woman I was helping out staring at him in open appreciation. He was quite handsome, even I must admit, but I ignored him and went back to tea preparation. Tea takes all of your attention, all of your heart. If you don't give it everything you got, it will fail you, because you've already failed yourself. Once the tea was prepared and the women were enjoying it iced, I stood up and approached the conspicuous newcomer. "Mr. Thompson, I take it? What can I get for you today?" Most of the time, I start by asking what a customer likes, what a customer needs, and what ailments are troubling them. I like to help people, but I was very wary of Jamie. Nothing good comes from a poisoned plant, after all. "Well, I'm actually here to get something for my grandmother. See, her mind is going. I read that tea is good for dementia, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations." It's true. Studies have shown that certain kinds of tea are good at preserving brain mass, but as of yet, nothing in modern medicine is miraculous enough to reverse dementia. Still, nature works in funny and great ways. I went behind the front counter to examine my selection of green teas. "You know, my grandmother, she probably wouldn't drink it if she knew that you had prepared it." I grunted in assent, none too keen on continuing our conversation. Jamie didn't seem to notice my reticence, or perhaps he just didn't care. "But you know, I'm hoping that maybe this will help patch things up between you. I think she'd really like you if she got to know you. I've always found you so fascinating." I selected some Girkuro Imperial and turned to face him, appraising his expression. The light in his eyes told me that he was using his grandmother as a pretense to come see me. Oh. Ignoring his obvious interest, I prepared the tea leaves and rang up his purchase, explaining how they were best brewed and when to drink it for the best results. To his credit, he was very attentive, although he seemed more interested in my lips than the words coming out of them. Well, thank you for this. I'll give it to my grandmother and come back to tell you the results. There's no need to, I stated, anxious to get him out of my store, but he smiled in return, not a bit perturbed by my attitude. Oh, you can't get rid of me that easily, Miss Marnie. I'll be back. With that, he turned and strode out of the store, the tourist still gawking at his tall, muscular frame. That was the start of all the trouble. Since that day, Jamie had started coming in regularly, always asking for my recommendations, always claiming that the tea we brewed helped his grandmother greatly. I seriously doubted that, but I didn't bother correcting his ignorance. After all, it was just a facade. At the close of each purchase, he would ask me the exact same question. So, do you have any plans for the night? Most of the time, I declined to answer. I had to admit, he was patient and persistent. He never missed a day. He was also sweet, in his own little way. He handed out compliments like candy, but only ever to me. Sometimes he brought in flowers, although I couldn't keep them in the store. The scent would taint the tea. He brought me sweets too, on occasion, and it was really getting on my nerves. Finally, one day he didn't immediately ask me out. Instead, he presented me with an opportunity, one that was too good to pass up. Honestly, Marnie, I'll do anything you want just to have one date. What do I have to do? You can't afford a date with me, I assured him, although the wheels in my head were already turning. Money isn't an object. Living next to my grandma all these years, you have to know my family is loaded. He flashed me with his patented, arrogant grin that somehow managed to hold a certain magnetic charm. Name it, and I'll do it. I'll make you understand how serious I am. He seemed so serious, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he could be the one I'd been searching for. And if he was, oh, I'd never dared dream. I grabbed a post-it note out and began scribbling the details on it as I told him what I wanted more than anything in the world. There is tea grown in the Fujian province of China called Dahao Po, or Big Red Robe as it translates. It grows high on the mountains and there's only a few select tea masters that are able to pick it. However, what many people don't know is that there are actually two strains of Dahong Pao, the kind that is sold to the public and a rarer kind that is used in medicine and religious rituals. I glanced into his eyes, but they remained impassive. I dared to finish. I want you to get it for me. He smirked as though he was amused to my reticence. No problem. Is it expensive? I paused to consider that question. The tea itself? No. If you tell them how you need it, if you tell them I need it, they'll give it to you. Only you have to fly to China and get it yourself. They won't send it to you. They won't be able to find a trace of them outside their own little province. They're cut off from the world, and that's what makes their tea so special. Jamie paused as if to consider this, making a serious face and stroking his chin. Finally, he winked at me. Consider it done. My heart skipped a beat, all this time searching for the right person, and he'd been right next to me, waiting for me to notice him. Life seemed to move at a more glacial pace after that. Jamie bought tickets and set the date for 6 months after I gave him my request. During that half year, he studied Mandarin with a passion that I'd never seen in anyone else before. He also managed to track down all the Fujianese natives and began studying the dialect. He took very careful instruction from me as to how he could find these master tea pickers. The day before he left, he came to see me, glowing with confidence as though he had already succeeded in his quest. I knew that the worst was yet to come for him, but he didn't seem concerned. Before he walked out of my store, he stood in front of me and requested, no, demanded, a kiss for good luck. I was so excited and flustered that I leaned in to give him a peck on the lips without a second thought. He laughed at my blushing cheeks and walked out, anticipating a grand adventure. Weeks passed, several of them in fact, and not yet a word from Jamie. I tried to remind myself to be patient after all. He had to, 1, arrive in China, hike mountains, and then navigate his way to the secret property of the master pickers. Reaching them would take time, and that's not to mention gaining their trust. I could only hope that they would be a little bit more compliant when he mentioned my name. And then after a few more weeks, I noticed Miss Thompson was too preoccupied to harass me or scream racial obscenities towards me. She seemed shaken by Jamie's absence. Not that it surprised me. He was, after all, her primary caretaker. And though she could still manage on her own at this point, she always liked the company. I was beginning to think that I would never hear back from Jamie when, one morning, I arrived at the tea house to find a man sitting in the front of the shop. He was an elderly Chinese man wearing traditional garb. In his arm he held a black lacquered chest. My heart stopped. When he saw me approach, he knelt in front of me and kowtowed 3 times. I inclined my head as a gesture of appreciation. Then, I opened the tea house and let him inside. We didn't exchange any words, although I am fluent in both Mandarin and Fujianese. Instead, I brewed him a cup of golden monkey black tea, which he drank for the ritual's sake. Once he was finished with his tea, he walked out the door and out of my life. But he left the chest behind. My hand shook as I lifted it, feeling its severe heft, and carried it down to the back room, locking the door and closing the blinds. I opened the chest. The first thing I saw were the bones. Each and every bone in Jamie's body sat in that chest, neatly packed into a solid mass. I took them out one at a time, spreading them all over my work table, admiring their pristine white color. I had never seen something so beautiful. Beneath the bones, separated by a wooden slot, was the tea, the small, dark green leaves with distinct golden flecks. That was how I knew they had given me the right product. The flashes of gold were the ticket. Yes, Jamie was the one I'd been waiting for, the one I needed, the bargaining chip that got me my most precious treasure. He was a perfect sacrifice. Miss Thompson changed after Jamie was officially declared missing. It was assumed that he had died in China hiking. An experienced hiker can easily go missing without the proper guide. And, just like that, she found herself alone in the world. Her other children and grandchildren would have nothing to do with her. She stopped screaming at me in the mornings. She stopped coming outside at all. But I just couldn't leave her alone like that. One morning, I brought a special tea over just for her. When I knocked on the door, I half expected her to cuss me out, shouting obscenities and misquoted Bible verses. Instead, she led me into her kitchen, and I brewed her tea. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. After a few minutes, she spoke on her own, about how Jamie had been so taken with me, sung my praises until she herself had begun to come around, about how much she had always loved him, and how her whole life had revolved around him ever since he had been born. She began crying at one point. In fact, she kept crying until I set her tea in front of her, at which point she absent-mindedly sipped the brew and gave me a surprised look. "This is good," I smiled at her. "It is, isn't it?" It only took a few days to get Miss Thompson to agree that I should be her new primary caretaker. Of course, she didn't need much care anymore, not after she began drinking my tea. After a few weeks, her forgetfulness, her signs of dementia, they began to fade. She was as sharp as she'd always been. Of course, that was intentional. I do, after all, want her to live a nice, long life, full of memories of Jamie and the agony of never knowing what happened to him. It's amazing what a little tea with bone marrow in it can do to a person. As for me, well, I got what I wanted. I got the rare formula I need to get my tea healing powers. I got the sacrifice for those brews that require something darker, and without Miss Thompson's ranting and screaming, my mornings became much more peaceful.